Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's series of lecture videos on the material, form, and context for the first text we'll be reading this semester, Beowulf. This will become a very familiar rhythm to you as we proceed through the course. Each week, usually on Mondays, you'll be proceeding through these videos on these three topics: material, form, and context for every text that we read. And since this is the first time we're doing it, I'm going to say a little bit about what these concepts mean. So the first concept that we're working with, this video, is devoted to the materials of Beowulf. Now, what do I mean by materials? I literally mean what the book is physically made of. What is Beowulf written on, and how was it written? The assumption behind this approach is that the material form of Beowulf is important to understanding the narrative itself. How it's written, what it's written down on, helps us to understand the story. So in this video, we ask questions like, what is a book made of? And how does that influence a narrative's meaning? How does it influence the audience, like who reads the narrative, and its accessibility? So this is a really important question, especially in early British literature, because we take a lot of things for granted in later literature about how books are made, but usually those things work differently in the more distant past. Okay, so one of the things we need to ask ourselves is, what did books look like before the printing press? You're probably familiar with this story of the printing press arriving in Europe in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, depending on what part of Europe you're in, and how that really changed how books were written. I'm already getting ahead of ourselves because we haven't gotten to that period of time yet in this course. We are very much before the printing press. Here's an image of the printing press right here. And here's an image of what a printed book looks like. But again, Beowulf is before this. So what happens before the printing press? Well, there's a form of book that we tend to now call manuscripts. And by that word, it's a Latin word that you can hear written by hand. Manu is hand, script is writing. So a manuscript is a book that is written by hand, which is how all books were made before the printing press. And they were made one at a time. Each manuscript was copied individually by a professional scribe. Usually a manuscript is not just one text either. If you had a book full of vellum or paper, as we call it now, you want to use every page. So you're not just going to write down one story and then close the book. No, you're going to fill it up as much as you can. So a manuscript often contains many texts in one book, kind of like our Norton textbook, it has that in common with that. Usually there's less emphasis on who wrote stories in a manuscript. That's a theme that will be coming up a lot more as we talk about these anonymous narratives in the early part of British literature. Manuscripts were made of very expensive materials. Instead of paper, which we now think of as pretty cheap, vellum was used, which is made of young animal skin. So essentially they're using bleached leather. That's what the pages are made of. So of course that's really expensive. Like a leather bag is a lot more expensive than a piece of paper these days. So imagine if you're using a leather bag as a piece of paper. And it's also much more sturdy. Leather lasts a lot longer than paper as well. So it's expensive, but it also has long-lasting power influence because of how well it's made. So manuscripts, when they survive, they tend to be in pretty good condition because of that. And then finally, manuscripts are deeply time consuming to make because, again, they're made one at a time. A scribe uses a source text and then just writes the next one right next to it. So that's very time consuming, and that means they were very expensive, which again means they're really only affordable to the elites, the upper classes. So these are all features of a manuscript. Now, I want to ask, what about the manuscript of Beowulf? My head is in the way. I'm going to move myself down. I hope you don't get seasick, carsick, or whatever as I do this. Here, we're looking at an image of the manuscript of Beowulf. And now I'm going to ask you to pause this video if you have not yet spent some time analyzing the manuscript of Beowulf. There's a link for that right in our module this week. I'd like you to go look at an image of the Beowulf manuscript and just study it for, 60 seconds. See what you notice. Okay, so when you're back, once you've done that, I want to see what the manuscript of Beowulf can tell us. Well, we know that this manuscript comes from the time period somewhere between 975 and 1025 CE. People can date manuscripts using carbon dating, using the style of script that scribes are writing in. All of that helps to establish a certain time period of a manuscript. It survived a fire in 1731, so you can notice just how singed the edges of this page is, and how it actually cuts off some of the words themselves because the fire got that close. So we've lost crucial parts of this manuscript as well because of that fire. You'll also notice that it's a relatively plain manuscript. In the weeks to come, we're going to see really ornate, gorgeous, colorful manuscripts with lots of illustrations. This is not one of them. It's very plain. But scholars believe that's not because they lack the technology to make it beautiful. In fact, it seems like the people who wrote this manuscript down kept it very plain on purpose because it was likely used as a performance text rather than a reading text. It was very likely that the person using this text would use it to perform the tale of Beowulf for listeners, either reading it off the page or memorizing it and then performing it in front of a court of listeners. So because of that purpose, it seems like the manuscript is kind of very simple because it's really not meant to be read by lots of people in its material form, but it's meant to be recited by a shop who is a courtly storyteller in this Old English period that we're in. All right, so this is video 1. This is our exploration of the material forms, the material conditions of Beowulf. In the next video, we're going to discuss some of the forms in Beowulf.